let's talk about capital. Generally, capital means any kind of resource, capital goods, which is necessary to accumulate and to use in the production of any other goods. This may be buildings, equipment, tools, stocks of resources, and so on. Consumers also need capital, or consumer capital goods, houses, cars, furniture, other durable goods. And to acquire these capital goods, firms and consumers may use their own savings or they may borrow money from the capital market. And by the capital market, we understand the market of money which can be borrowed to buy these goods. So the capital market is essentially the market for long-term loans. In this market, anyone can lend money for a long term, or anyone can borrow money for a long term. We can analyze this market as any other market with the help of supply and demand diagram. The price at this market is interest rate. How much money is paid for the use of borrowed money during a given period? This price is usually expressed as a percentage. For example, the annual interest rate of 10% means that the borrower will pay to the lender 10% of the amount of the loan for every year of using this money. The supply in this market is represented by firms and consumers who want to take long-term loans. The demand is represented by, if both firms and consumers represent demand, who represents supply? Also firms and consumers? And how do they decide who will lend and who will borrow? Maybe some firms and consumers have money and some need money. Not exactly. It's a bit more complicated. Let me explain. Let's start with a firm. Any firm may use money in its own operations to buy some resources, produce some goods, and sell them at a profit. So we may build a marginal return curve for money, as for any other resource. This marginal return curve will have a negative slope because of the universal law of diminishing return. Every additional amount of money used to expand operations of the firm will have the lower return than the previous one. This curve may have different kinds of shape at the beginning, as you remember. It may even grow or be horizontal, but after some moment it should get a negative slope. Now let's suppose that the firm has some money, 1 million rubles, its own capital. Let's put this amount on the horizontal axis. So, will this firm borrow or lend money? It depends on the market interest rate. Let us suppose that the market rate for long-term loans is 5%. According to our marginal return curve, we should use 1.6 million in our operations to maximize our profit. We have 1 million of our own money, so we need to borrow extra 0.6 million in the market. Let's now suppose that the market rate for long-term loan is 15%. According to our marginal return curve, we should use only 0.4 million. So the rest of our million cannot be employed with profit in our firm because of the opportunity cost of using it here is higher. The opportunity cost of using it here is 15% of market interest rate. So if we apply this money in our firm, we'll get only a lower return. So we can derive a conclusion. If the market interest rate is lower than 10%, we should borrow money according to our marginal return curve. If the market rate is higher than 10%, we should lend part of our money in the market. Which part? According to our MR curve. So, our firm may be a borrower or a lender depending on the level of the market interest rate. If the market interest rate is higher than 10%, the firm will take a loan, and its demand curve will be represented by the segment of the MR curve lower than 10%. If the market interest rate is higher than 10%, the firm will offer a loan, and its supply curve will be represented also by the segment of MR curve higher than 10%. Now, let's put these supply and demand curves on a separate diagram. They start at the same point on the vertical axis. At this interest rate, the firm decides to switch from lending to borrowing, and vice versa. Okay, what about consumers? As you may guess, this is quite a similar case. An individual may lend or borrow depending on the market interest rate. Sure, there might be different types of consumers. Let's discuss two types. The first type is saving money to purchase some consumer goods: a house, a car, a laptop. If the interest rate is lower than some threshold level, I*, the consumer decides to borrow money to buy the good now and later pay back the debt. And the lower the interest rate, the more money the consumer may decide to borrow, because it's easier to pay back the loan if the interest rate is low. If the interest rate is higher than I*, the consumer decides to save money, to lend it in capital market and to accumulate the necessary amount of money for durable goods purchase. The higher the interest rate, the more money the consumer may decide to save, because current consumption becomes more expensive. Instead of consuming 1 ruble today, the individual may consume more than 1 ruble tomorrow. The second type of the consumer is saving money for a future event or retirement. It's impossible to move this consumption today, so there is no trade-off between borrowing and saving. The consumer can only save. How do these savings depend on the interest rate? It's reasonable to assume that this is a positive relationship. The higher the interest rate, the more the person will save, because the opportunity cost of non-saving increases. Finally, we can draw the market supply and demand curves for long-term loans. The supply curve is represented by firms and individuals. It has a positive slope because individual supply curves have positive slope, and they start at different levels of interest rate. And this is the demand curve represented by the same firms and individuals. It has a negative slope because individual demand curves have negative slope, and they start at different levels. These firms and individuals switch from borrowing to lending in this market at one or another interest rate. And the market equilibrium, the intersection of supply and demand curves, determines the equilibrium distribution of firms and individuals between these two roles. At the equilibrium interest rate, people and firms split into lenders and borrowers in such a way to equate the demand and supply of the capital.